Thank you everybody for joining us today. We will be talking about the digital front door. My name is Ben Muter. I'm a software integration consultant with EDCI. So the digital front door, really what it is, it's the start of every interaction that our agents have with our customers. And no matter what channel that's on, that interaction in the beginning tends to be very repetitive. So what we want to do is we want to take that and put it up into the digital front door, as well as provide data points so that we can do predictive self-service and empower the agent. So some of the things that are driving the conversation around digital front door are around how our customers are communicating with us, right? So our customers are communicating with us in different channels in different ways, and this has been growing over the last couple of years. We gave them this great little iPhone with all these different apps that can go ahead and communicate with our organizations. Gartner thinks by 2022, 70% of customer interactions will be emerged technologies such as conversational AI, chats, and mobile messages, as well as 70% of our customers are researching online before choosing a product and a service, and we're all well aware of this. We have very educated consumers these days, but the interesting part of this is that 51% will reach out to us or look at us through social media, as well as 35% will expect the same type of customer service through a social media channel as they would dialing into the organization. Digital marketing, we all have our marketing firms, our marketing people within our organizations that are reaching out to our customers through these different channels, and that's kind of where the digital front door takes place. Is we want to meet the customer where they are. We don't want them to leave the channel that they're communicating with us to be able to service them, right? So what we're doing with the digital front door is we're giving a consistent message, whether that's through social media, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or our traditional channels like voice and SMS. We definitely have a lot of web chat out there too, and mobile apps where we want to keep that consistent same message and same capabilities of being able to self-service the customer through that. And a lot of companies, to what we typically deal with, are pretty close to there, right? So what you see is you see the customer being presented with options to go down a self-service channel. And sometimes this is built out for social media, and then also web chat, and then maybe a different build out for voice and SMS. So you see some different build outs depending on where that channel is. And also we're presenting these options to the customers. So the customer might have an option to return a product or check updates on their appointments or something along those lines, right? Our typical menu options, press or say, return product or something along those lines, right? But then we stick them in this self-service scenario, and what ends up happening is they get frustrated in this self-service scenario because there's no easy way out. And the reason why a lot of times we're not providing that easy way out is because when they do get to the agent, we're not funneling that information collected correctly down to the agent. So the agent tends to have to go back to where they started within the IVR that they were working with, and they have to identify the customer again, or they have to understand how they can help them, right? So things that were collected or maybe not fully collected hasn't been brought back down to the agent, as well as the agent is given customer data. It's just a lot of times that customer data is overreaching. So it's not really designed for that particular call itself, but more in a general sense of here's all the data that you can utilize to service this customer. So there's a lot of repetition here, and that repetition is causing frustration not only for the customer but for the agent as well. So how does that how does that relate to a digital front door? What is the difference? Well, the difference really revolves around conversational AI. Conversational AI is the technology that allows a digital front door to exist. So instead of presenting all these different options, what we're doing is we're asking the customer, how can we help you today? And that's throughout all our channels, right? So no matter what channel you're on, it doesn't matter. We're not asking you to provide us options. We're asking you to provide the reason why you're communicating with us today. And then once we understand that reason, we'll put you through the appropriate self-service channel, or we will bring you to an agent depending on what that call is, right? So with that said, one of the things that we can do here is, with the consistent technology of conversational AI being throughout all channels that the customers are interacting with us today, is if they start on one channel and then come back later at a different time or a different point, we can bring them back to where they left off. And we'll talk a little bit about that and how that all works in the next couple slides. So the first thing is conversational AI needs to understand who they're speaking to. We don't want to let anybody self-service anything, right? So we have to identify who we're talking to. And traditionally, we like to do things like, scrape the ante, get the phone number, maybe a social media profile, and try to match up that phone number and name. Well, with conversational AI, what we want to do is we want to keep consistent with how your agents actually identify your customer. So how those agents are processing those identification questions, we build that into the conversational AI. So no matter what channel they're on, whether we're scraping data or not scraping data, we ask the appropriate questions to be able to identify this customer. And once we have that customer identified, we open up the doors to do even more for them in the digital front door. But depending on your industry, there might be other requirements to identify a customer, and that could be around biometrics, two-factor authentication like PINs. Disinformation is, underused in my opinion. Disinformation is great, especially when we're talking about multiple different channels. We can send over chat multiple choice of, where have you lived in the past 5 years, A, B, or C, and this really helps identify that customer as well too. And then what happens if they're not a customer, right? So the nice part about having the conversational flow in the artificial intelligence is we can go ahead and start onboarding this customer if they're not currently a customer of ours. And we do the onboarding through a conversational AI just as an agent would do the onboarding as if they were talking to an agent. And what we find is a reduction in agent capacity by 15%, as well as errors are down 55%, just from the fact that the technology is doing it versus human error. Now, there's always going to be a certain margin of error in conversational AI. This is due to tuning, and the longer that you have artificial intelligence running in your solution, the better it's going to become over time. So what do we know about the customer? So now that we've identified them, they walk through the identification questions, and we are able to know that this is, Jake Beyer, and Jake Beyer has data associated to his account. So which data is important to you right now before we even get into, being able to figure out the reason for the call? One of those might be language, right? So what language do they speak? Let's not present them with an English conversational path if they don't speak English. Another thing that we can do is we can do things like customer loyalty. Like, they've earned these customer loyalty statuses over time with your organization if you do that, and they want to be treated as such. So we can utilize different conversational flows within the AI to address different levels of customers. So when it comes into, okay, what's the reason for your call? Well, this is something that you have to kind of feel out for yourself. What are the most common calls, and how can we be predictive about it, right? So like a lot of times what we see is a lot of calls are public information. Like, For instance, where's your location, right? Or what time are you open at, right? Things along those lines. Well, with utilizing the data that we've already collected, because we identified the customer and we've collected the data about the customer, so we know where they live, we know where their address is, so we can pull up the closest store or facility near them and say, are you talking about Appleton East Side? Well, yes, I am. Okay, great. We're open from 5 to 9. So we can utilize the data real time to be able to discuss with the customer about the intent or reason for the call. Another thing is account management. So a lot of times we like to update accounts while we're doing self-service. So for instance, if they're paying a bill, but giving the customer the access to be able to utilize the digital front door to do things like update a credit card number or update an address because maybe they have a shipment coming or something along those lines, through any channel that they prefer, whether that's Facebook or voice. That's really the value there, being able to get rid of a lot of those upfront calls that our agents are typically dealing with. And you have to identify those in your organization, but the understanding of the data points to be able to help you with that method. Another thing is predictive self-service. So maybe your utility or you have a large website and maybe it's down, so there's some type of service outage. Well, we know in this area that anybody calling within this area might have a service outage, so we utilize that data to identify that. So when they do call in, instead of giving them option 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to choose from, we're being more selective about what we're presenting them. So there's a good chance, based off my data points, that you are calling about a service outage. So I'm going to ask you, are you calling about a service outage? And then help that customer through that if that is the case. And you want to do this in a high certainty, right? So you want higher percentages, and this can work in a lot of different areas, like scheduling. If they have an appointment coming up, well, let's ask them about the appointment, because typically if you do appointments and a customer is calling with an appointment, like a Tuesday at 8, there's a good chance that they'll be calling about that appointment. As well as recent purchases. Did they just get a delivery? Could it be potentially a return? Right? So these types of scenarios, being able to understand the patient or the customer's data and then present that data from the aspect of being able to predict what they're calling about, is really how we can really up those self-service containment rates. Billing's another example of that. If there's a bill or outstanding payment, interaction history. So this goes back to starting in one channel and going to another channel, right? So if I started an interaction with Facebook Messenger and I'm calling in, maybe a couple hours later into the main number, understanding my last interactions and how I've dealt with that, I can be presented, would you like to start where you left off? And, good chance I will like to do that. So this is where we kind of think about what can be a high percentage of self-service. Instead of giving those options, we're going to be very precise in what we're asking. And then when it comes to ticket history, now this is kind of where, that bridge between self-service and the agent really comes into play. So if we know that they have an open ticket through our services or something along those lines, and we know that it's just too complicated for conversational AI to help with, instead of just dropping them anywhere, well, let's figure out what that ticket's for and make sure that we're transferring to somebody who can actually assist with that ticket, right? So that's really comes down to the transfer. So the idea here is self-service when we can, intelligently transfer when we must. And what does that mean? That means that if we're going to make a transfer, make sure that we're going to the right spot in the organization to really help that customer out with that transfer. We've already collected the customer's identity. We've already collected the reason why they're calling. So when we go to an agent, that agent shouldn't have to do anything further to understand why this customer is calling and being transferred into queue. And then on top of that, it's very important to provide relative data. So if it is, let's say, a return that they were calling about and they get to queue, and what we're going to see is the customer has already been identified. We know that they're returning a product. We know which product they're returning, but the data, the relevant data would be, what product, when did they buy it, and then as well as any type of application that you use to process those returns, pop up the exact window that they need to be able to process that return. So there's no searching, there's no looking around. So provide relevant data that has been collected from the digital front door into the agent so they can go ahead and help that customer with whatever reason for the call may be. So to take this even a step further, we have this great digital front door, right? And we're able to service all these inbound types of inquiries through all the channels. Well, let's take that a step further and create a two-way outbound. So a lot of times what we see is, different types of advertisement or notifications to the customers. It tends to be one way. So when they get something like, hey, your shipment is going to be arriving on Tuesday, well, if they have questions about their shipment, they might have to call, right? And that drives communication back into the contact center. So when we look at that from a communication standpoint, if we can provide them the digital front door to be able to service even on those outbound communications and self-service themselves, or at best, transfer to queue, but at the same time, what we're doing is we're really reducing those calls. Only necessary calls come into the contact center with our outbound communication. So we're trying to take those campaigns that we typically do and build a realistic conversational technology around so that these communications can be serviced on the same channel that you reached out on. So some things to think about when you think about conversational AI is your conversational AI, your digital front door, really should be the same training documents and same flows be put into creation of that conversational AI. So what does your current training document say? What is an agent taught? So whatever that agent's taught is what you want to teach the conversational AI for this digital front door. You want to take a look at your best agents and say, okay, what are they doing differently that makes them the best agents? And then put that into the conversational AI. And the reason why you want to do that is that's how you create that consistent message throughout all channels. So no matter how they're reaching into us, we know that we're being consistent throughout all those channels by following our training documents and the success rate of our best agents. So some of the things that you want to think about are, what are you doing today that identifies a customer, right? So how are they identified? How does an agent do that? What are the questions that they ask to ensure that they're on the right account, right? Then any rule sets. What are your rule sets to identify this customer to allow them to self-service? If you're in healthcare, that might be one thing. If you're in finance, that could be another thing. So make sure that you build in those technologies to ensure, on top of the conversational AI, you could do biometrics or something along those lines to ensure that the security methodology is all there to allow for that customer to self-service. The other thing is identify what's a high percentage of likelihood for their calls. So all those data points that you have historically, look at them. If a customer has placed 5 orders and they call in, what are they typically asking about, right? So over time, you can collect this information and then you can utilize it to be more predictive. Instead of providing all those options to the customer, we can provide that predictive service, one option to get them to the next step. And then you rank those. So based off of, different types of interactions with the company, we can say 80% that they're calling about this scenario, so let's go ahead and present that as their self-service option. Also, what data is going to be useful? So because as we move into the agent knows who the customer is, knows the reason for the call. So figure out what data points are important for that reason of the call. Figure out what screens, applications are used to be able to service that call. And once we know that, when it does come into agent, what you can really do is provide that agent with the data that they need for this call, and with the windows and applications that they need to service the call. So if you're wanting to know a little bit more and kind of thinking, well, how do I start internally? Like, what are the areas that that would help move this conversation internally along? Well, in the digital front door, what you're really seeing is average handle times. Now, when we say reduction in average handle times by 90 seconds, we're not necessarily saying with the call altogether, because it still takes about the same amount of time to service, right? But the difference is that we're uplifting a lot of that conversation that the agent is typically having into the digital front door. And when we uplift that conversation, we're typically on a non-contained, meaning that it goes to an agent. We're typically saving about 1.5 minutes of time before it even gets to the agent. And then we're saving another, typically 20 to 30 seconds by providing the agent with all the right data at their disposal for the reason of the call. So we're going to see a reduction in average handle times. Deflections. By doing the predictive self-service, we're going to see a higher deflection rate, a higher self-service rate. These calls don't even make it into the contact center. And we've seen up to, we got 40% here. That's about standard. We've seen it up to 90%. But really what we're not trying to do is self-service everything. There's going to be scenarios you can't self-service 100%, but we want to make that as efficient as possible, and that transition to self-service to agent as efficient as possible as well. Onboarding, right? So we're onboarding our new customers through this digital front door. And by doing so, we're able to not only save capacity for our agents' time, but we also have the ability to reduce errors, right? So we're bringing that error rate down significantly by allowing it through conversational AI. And then brand message. I think this is really important. You got all those channels. You want to be able to consistently say the correct message to all the customers reaching out, no matter if they're on Facebook or if they're calling into the organization or SMS. And by having a digital front door with a strong AI behind it, we're able to service those customers the same way every time. And that's all I had here today. So if there's any questions.